Hey everyone, my name is Gabe Kennedy and welcome to the State of the Planet, a conversation series where we sit with thought leaders and innovators to discuss the state of the planet. Today we have Henry Rich, an entrepreneur since the age of 22 who is focused on the cross-section of building community, climate action, and food and beverage, aka hospitality. Henry is the owner of the Oberon Group, one of my favorite restaurant groups in the city, who you may know from Rucola to Redora or June Wine Bar, all of which have an environmental component and responsibility built into their operations. So Henry, I'm so glad to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak.
Thanks, Gabe. Always a pleasure to catch up.
Always a pleasure. So Henry, I know you personally and professionally, and one of the things that has continually astounded me outside of the fact that you have just incredible hospitality properties is your dedication to learning and continual learning. And so I know you're in the midst of sort of a I believe master's program, but all of these are huge feats. And I'm curious, what was that moment in your life where you screamed eureka and said, I want to, go after sustainability?
I have to give credit to Anthony Mient, who started Zero Foodprint. Prior to meeting Anthony, I was mostly just focused on doing things that would build community, revitalize a neighborhood, make somewhere that I want to go near where I live, or explore some other thing like natural wine, like June. But it was actually with Meta where Anthony came in and dropped off a copy of Drawdown, which had just come out, and said, check it out. We're responsible for 24% of climate change in the food industry. And from that moment forward, I felt as a business owner, an entrepreneur working in food, I did have an abnormal level of responsibility just to cover the damage that our industry, causes on a regular basis, and try to compensate. And that was the first thing that we did was making that restaurant carbon neutral. And then since there, we've just tried to figure out how we can, possibly make an impact on the industrial food system and its commensurate carbon footprint, which is high.
Yeah, sorry, we just had a little technical burp. It really is remarkable around like when I'm reading Bill Gates' book right now, and it's like there's so much information around our impact, and yet I think there's so much paralysis of how we actually move forward. And so I think you've really kind of put things into motion in a way that is so admirable. I'd love to learn more about kind of, 24% you said?
Yeah, it's measured a lot of different ways. And a lot of the emissions obviously come from, cattle and things that people know about, but a lot of the emissions are caused by, land use and deforestation and food waste. But about a quarter of emissions is about right. I've heard as high as 26%. Obviously, these are moving targets too. And there's a lot of good things happening with energy, a lot of good things happening with transport. But then when you look in areas like food and construction, progress is a little bit more difficult to come by.
So if we talk about food and want to get a little bit more granular in terms of kind of what's the state of the planet as it relates to food, what do you find to be the biggest pain points and therefore sort of greatest opportunity to move the needle forward?
Yeah, greatest pain point is probably, I don't know that anybody's ever asked a question in quite that way. probably the fact that the combination of food subsidies for industrial agriculture mixed with high income inequality, mixed with high healthcare costs equals it's very difficult to switch to a regenerative agricultural system in this country because there's so many interests and there's so much downward pressure on prices. This is an interesting thing that I've been learning about more recently, but actually, as a percentage of disposable income, Americans spend the least out of any kind of Western country on food, and we have the highest income inequality and the highest healthcare costs. So there's some intractable issues having to do with the ways in which the industry is subsidized, with the fertilizers and all of the kind of inorganic methods that allow you to make a colossal number of calories, but it's not leaving the planet in a healthy shape. It's not leaving people in healthy shape. And it's just generally not great for equity across the board.
So as a restaurateur and climate activist, what have you been able to put into practice to push against those systems? Because truly, I think being healthy in America is a task. Like,
Yeah, for sure.
it's an uphill battle.
It's not something you can take for granted. Yeah, so in terms of what we try to do is we try to pursue radical proof of concept for some lofty sustainability goal like at Redora. So actually the person that introduced us, Lauren Singer, introduced me to the chef Doug McMaster, who owns Silo in England. And Doug is well known for having a completely trash-free restaurant. And we had the privilege of hosting his pop-up in New York a couple of years ago. And then when we were kind of rebranding a restaurant, we decided to try out the trash-free wine bar, just so that people have kind of an option and can explore the conversation. Like, it's very easy to visualize, like, oh, you have a restaurant that literally doesn't have a trash. You don't have a trash pickup. What happens when you have all the trash around you that you normally have this bin following you around for your entire life, and kind of engaging people. Because I think even if you want to be sustainable, there just aren't that many great options for you, because America kind of runs on plastic. And so if you wake up one day and you want to be as sustainable as possible, it'll be the worst day of your life, because you realize that's difficult to impossible. So just creating outlets for people that have this positive desire to build what I just call positive climate self-esteem, where you've done something good for the planet that's not impossible, and then from there you can develop a relationship with your carbon footprint and climate change that you actually enjoy, that you have pride in, that you can talk to people about without feeling terrified or ashamed about being so confused around the topic. So we try to create these, just obviously one wine bar is not going to solve the problem, but by showing that that's possible in New York, we can start conversations where people are feeling good about themselves and climate in like the same thought. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it's a remarkable mission. I think the opportunity to move the conversation forward through a medium such as food is so real, and it extends into so many different kind of sectors of our life. It's a mentality that we had through building Plant People. People were asking, well, what is this thing? What does it do? It's a little bit taboo. It's a little bit scary. If we could put it on a menu and move the conversation forward and start normalizing the conversation, like normalizing it, all of a sudden, the conversation changes. So I admire what you're doing in terms of moving the climate conversation forward through your properties. what do you, I mean, you mentioned like the misconceptions and the confusion, right? It's such, it can be pretty daunting. I mean, what do you think the biggest misconceptions around, carbon neutrality, or, I feel like we're talking about such a broad, kind of subject that it's hard to get more granular, but what are some big misconceptions that you think people should know about?
Yeah, I think it starts with a conversation about, what should our ethical commitment be to not
Mhm.
externalize our waste and the cost of our carbon onto the most, vulnerable people in the world and the unborn. What should that obligation be, if any, to do something that's not the cheapest and most convenient thing for us as individuals or for our businesses, aside from kind of like what looks good on paper or what might be trending in the moment. Like when you wake up, and look in the mirror, you become an entrepreneur not just to, get rich, but because you have something to say. And how do you identify with that commitment? And I think, once you answer that question, and everybody has to answer it, for themselves, um, what can you do? You can be carbon neutral or, net zero emissions. And people will say, well, what does that mean? Why don't you just not create carbon with your business? And so this is the first kind of big misconception that we like talking about. 80% of the carbon emissions from our business are caused by the farms where we buy food from. And then the question is, why don't you just buy organic? And the answer is, well, frequently organic farms have higher, sometimes carbon emissions. It's something that needs to be dealt with separately with its own regenerative program. And um, it's not like you can just say organic and ergo it's sustainable. So or buy local and buy seasonal, and the job is just done for you. And so then that starts a conversation about the difference between scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and we're scope 3, net neutral and now net negative, where you're covering the entire upstream carbon and downstream carbon impact of your business. It's really easy to be scope 1 neutral because it just means that you're buying renewable power, which is a great start. But obviously, if you're an oil company, you can be scope 1 carbon neutral and just be buying renewable power or buying offsets for your electric bill. You're not really accounting for your full debt to society, unless you think about scope 3, and then it's in the trillions of dollars, and it's not workable.
Right.
So I think just pushing that conversation, what is it that we mean when we talk about wanting to offset and sequester to basically compensate for the carbon footprint of our suppliers. I think that's the thing that I enjoy talking about the most, because then people are like, oh wow, it's like the entire economy needs to be decarbonized. And you guys are buying offsets not because it's cheaper than buying renewable power, but because you want to actually clean up and take responsibility for everything that is caused by the existence of your business, which I think is a good place to start, when you're
Yeah,
setting a carbon budget.
yeah, no, I totally agree. And it's like simply investing in scope 1 is a lot more economical, right, than scope 3. Yet
Much smaller number.
sometimes it gets the same stamp of approval, and I think then it gets into like greenwashing territory. But I mean, can you just very quickly define what scope 1, 2, and 3 is?
Yeah, as far as I understand, and I'm not a huge expert on this, but scope 1 is basically the energy costs. I believe scope 2 is kind of electricity and heat. And I'm certain that scope 3 is all of the above and the upstream and downstream carbon costs. So, for scope 3, it would be, like I said, the carbon outputs of the farms that we're buying from, the transport from the farms to the restaurant, and then any kind of end of life cycle carbon outputs from our trash, needing things to be carted away. And obviously contained within that is the operational carbon caused by the restaurant. This is something that we've been talking a lot about in the program that I'm in, which is more based on buildings than it is about food. But similarly, when it comes to building, that's the other area where they're not making a lot of progress because cement and concrete is so carbon intensive. There's been a lot of focus on carbon neutral of the building as it's in operation, in that, okay, their electricity comes from solar, but sometimes 80% of the carbon cost of that building is its embodied carbon, what it took to actually raise it, with all the steel, all the cement, and then the end of life cycle projection on the carbon. And you need to account for the entire budget of your building, not just like, oh, I like went into Con Ed and I signed up for, renewable power. That's a great start. But when these companies are creating like carbon neutral headquarters, it's important to, actually make sure that it's not some like insane concrete and steel facade, but that it's actually built with like cross laminated timber or something that banks
Right.
carbon as opposed to emits, millions of tons.
So, I mean, where do you, so it's it's really interesting to me because we are so entrenched in fossil fuels, right? We're so deep in the consumption and reliance on fossil fuels that, that to me is undeniably the biggest thing that we need to change, right? Like, in theory, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, we could continue to create single-use plastics and completely eliminate our consumption of fossil fuels, burning of fossil fuels, and probably be okay. But if we eliminate single-use plastics, but we continue burning fossil fuels in the way that we are to, heat our buildings, to make the concrete, to make the glass, to, to fuel our engines, et cetera, like we're kind of out of luck, right?
Yeah. One of the downsides of being in this master's program is you got to see the current data, and in short, everything possible needs to be done over the next 9 years to potentially avoid the abrupt and irreversible tipping point, kind of spiral. Uh, it's a
on
great.
a great note, um, so I guess I don't know. I feel like we could go down a rabbit hole there. I mean, let's bring it back to food. In that,
Sure.
one of the issues that I have always found, or tentative issues that I found, is just around the true cost of food, right? Like, we can buy a tomato at the grocery store for 99 cents a pound, but there's no way in hell that tomato grown in Florida, grown in the winter, grown in sand, transported from Florida to New York should be costing 99 cents. So, like, if we're saying what is the system, the food system, and why is it so messed up? Like, can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Like, is it just simply the subsidies? How do we get companies to take more responsibility and ownership around the cost of the food in which the food that's being produced?
Yeah, it's just my opinion that all the wrong things are incentivized, which is to say maximum production as cheap as possible. Historically, income on food, spend on food as a percentage of disposable income was much more similar to, a country like Japan or Europe or other wealthy nations. It was much more in the like 15, 20, 25% range. It was a really significant expense. And now in the United States, that hangs between 6 and 9%. So we are spending far, far too little of our disposable income on food. But if you look at a graph of what we spend on healthcare compared to all of those countries, it's just going right there. So this isn't a point that gets as much play as it should, in my opinion. And then Britain's right in between. So Britain maybe spends like 10% and has the second most expensive healthcare system. So in my opinion, the thing to be subsidizing is not the manufacturer of industrial food products, but actual social support for people who need it. And then if food was a little bit more expensive, or if we were subsidizing the regenerative producers, it wouldn't be this society-wide issue. Now, if you doubled the price of food in this country, there's so much poverty. And so if you just remove the subsidies without kind of putting them to support people in other ways, it would be like maybe a revolution, right? Like people would go hungry and obviously wouldn't stand for that. But there needs to be some kind of reapportionment of that budget. And, as far as like why the farm bill is written the way it is, nobody knows. It's just this thing that happens every 5 years, where the companies that are used to getting the subsidy are very, very good at lobbying for it. And it creates a lot of distortions. And, who could be against cheaper food? But the fact is that cheaper food is positively correlated with higher income inequality and more poverty, and kind of keeping people in poverty and keeping people sick and in poverty. And so there's a lot of other countries that tried it different ways that are doing a lot better, and they're spending more money on food. So I couldn't agree with you more that the expectation that you should be able to feed yourself for 99 cents is a huge part of the problem.
What are some of the countries that are doing it well, and what are they doing different?
Literally any other country has spends more on food and less on healthcare. So
well, let's
any
talk
other
about I don't know. I would assume the Nordic countries are probably doing
well,
pretty well, right? They're all
I don't know. Yes, they always do well, and despite having like an impossible climate to grow food in, and but
Was there like a textbook example, right? Is there like a case study of, hey, here's a model that works?
So yeah, I think you could pick any country in Western Europe and say, here is a social safety net that basically leaves people with more money left over to buy food. It's kind of a dumb way of putting it, but like there's a lot of people that don't have more than 6% of a budget left to spend money on food in this country, because so much of it is going to sky high rents and a trip to the hospital that wasn't covered, and all of these other things, or maybe just insurance, right?
Right.
So I think I don't know how you go from where we are now and kind of like roll back the clock on inequality going up and up and up, and food getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and healthcare getting more and more and more expensive. I'm sure there are people in the current administration who are thinking about this, I hope. But yeah, I think to the point of it is food. We can't expect good food to be super cheap. And I would also say, from a sustainability perspective, it cannot be a human right that red meat is super cheap. It's just, it externalizes the costs that we're externalizing there, which will be paid by somebody, and will make everybody poorer in the future, are incredibly high. And that is, were there ever a luxury food item, it's a steak. And that's a highly emotional issue for people that grew up with a subsidized industrial food system, where the costs were kind of hidden from them on multiple levels, in their healthcare, in the future cost of carbon cleanup. And then it's like, okay, the steak is going to be a little bit more expensive because we passed this carbon tax. And then you're having a conversation about taking away people's hamburgers. And that's a really effective line of argument for people that want to resist any type of responsible regulation around climate, because it's seen as a human right, no matter how much it hurts other people. And I just say, like, just count the cost. like of making a burger $1 cheaper today, like what that's going to cost in the future. And then just make an informed decision about whether you still feel good demanding that it be subsidized at the level that it is now. Because I think people just don't know how expensive it's going to be to clean up. And that money is going to pull at every other social priority that everyone cares about when it needs to be spent. And it'll be in our lifetimes.
So let's focus in just on, because I know that, a lot of your restaurants are vegetarian or, really lean into responsible sourcing and don't necessarily highlight, right? I'm not going to find like a 64-ounce, tomahawk or whatever on your menu at Redora. Let's go through. Can we go through just the cost of that hamburger? Because you're mentioning the externalized costs and whatnot, and I think it's just important to kind of paint the picture from the soybeans that are being grown to, maybe the healthcare costs or implications on the other end.
Sure. I mean, so the costs of like industrialized, cattle are far, far greater, and they involve a lot of carbon inputs in the form of like, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. These have other catastrophic effects on the environment. But if we're just talking about like farming with cattle the right way, and the costs that still has on the environment, there's a lot of controversial information out there about whether you can mob graze in a way that's carbon negative, that is really beyond me. But I think the assumption is that it takes like many, many, many calories to create a calorie of beef. I forget how many hundred, but it's a lot. How many thousands of gallons of water per calorie, maybe like 1,000 gallons of water. And of course, the emissions that everybody is familiar with from the methane, which is, depending on what time horizon you're using, 30 to 80 times more impactful than carbon for the environment. And then, of course, every time there's an increase in demand for beef worldwide, which happens every year, that's another, million acres of rainforest gone, so that ranchers can create pasture to raise their cattle. And that is by far the most catastrophic part of all of it, is the fact that demand for that product is, basically creates deforestation.
Yeah, it's like no matter what way you cut it, first off, totally agree that red meat is like no good. Probably just stop. We should probably stop eating red meat. I mean, well, we know it was not probably. We know we should be. But it's interesting because when we talk about like the deforestation and stuff, the idea that we can. I'm currently reading.
Nice.
Avoid climate disaster,
Yeah.
right? And a point that Mr. Gates makes is like, well, if you're going to plant the trees in the Amazon, you're then creating another opportunity for a farmer to cut down more trees to plant the soybeans that they need to then feed the cows, to then feed the humans. It's just a really bad cycle that we get into. So if there were 3 things that you could share with me and people who are listening that would stun. I want to be shocked. I want to be shocked into action.
Shocked into action.
Yeah. What would those 3 things be?
I think first is that there's 3 billion people moving to cities over the next 30 years. And in order to house everybody, there's going to be more construction in those 30 years, more square feet of construction than in all of human history to this point. And we do not have technology coming on board before 2050 to lower the carbon emissions of cement. And so that alone, if everything else was following the most ambitious targets, which we're not, creates kind of an unsustainable carbon load
Wow.
on the planet.
So you're saying
So
there's 3 billion people moving to cities in the next how many years?
30. Some of it is people moving from countries to cities. Some of it is new people being born. This is, basically the focus of my program is that this building is going to happen. You can't ask people to live, in slums as a human rights issue. How can this building happen in a way that doesn't send the world into a spiral above, 2, 3, 5 degrees centigrade? What is a path? Let alone a likely path? What is any path to support that? The other thing that I would say is that meat consumption is expected to rise by 50% across the world between now and the future, because there's more people, they have more money, they want more meat. People want to lead kind of a more affluent, status-driven life as they get more money and more people are pulled out of poverty. Um, and I guess the last thing that I would say that I find just like ever shocking is if we had started to draw down carbon in the 90s, we'd only need to draw down by 2.5% a year to get to where we need to be by 2030. But given that we're starting in 2021, it needs to be 10% a year. And if we don't really get going until 2025, it needs to be like 20% a year, which is just not going to happen. So and I'll add a last one, which I find very shocking. Every time we push a deadline into the future, not only does the cost of mitigating the carbon get more expensive, but there's kind of a side parallel cost of creating climate resilience. And so the world gets together, they're like, we're going to get serious. And at the next climate conference, and they're like, we pledged $200 billion toward averting climate change. And you think that that's all going to go into solar fields and plant-based foods and buying everybody an electric car. And what is happening is that countries around the world are saying, hey, this is about to be flooded. Our entire infrastructure for 20 million people, we need 50 billion of that just to survive. And by the way, it's your fault that this is happening, and it is. And so then the countries are like, oh, well, we're going to need like $1 trillion to actually meet all of the climate mitigation targets, because all the money that we thought we needed is now just needed for climate resilience. Now we're just building seawalls around New York. And this is the thing that pissed me off so much when New York City delayed its compost program to save like $20 million, and then simultaneously announced that they're spending $20 billion to create a seawall. Because that's the attitude that everybody has about climate change, is like, let's spend money basically not eliminating our own emissions, which are affecting everybody, but basically protecting ourselves against the inevitable rising of the seas. And there's only so much money, and the amount of money that's needed for resilience and adaptation is taking up a larger and larger amount of the pie, when there needs to be like way more money going toward investment in avoiding the collapse, not just kind of like handling it. So that's kind of my big concern. Is it the politics of that, or nightmarish?
That's so interesting. I never thought of that, right? Like the parallel of building the wall, like $100, we have $100, but we need to put it into the immediate kind of it's kind of human nature. It's like, right, I need to take care of this thing that's like right in front of me versus do a little work internally to help maybe prevent it in the future.
Yeah, you have a building that's on fire with people inside it, and slowly the two buildings next to it are also catching on fire, and you have like a firefighter. And the obvious answer to that is like, what a hellish problem. Let's get more firefighters. To which I would say, hamburgers should be more expensive. Like, if you want there to be money to basically cover both, somebody has to, really all of us need to contribute more to the cost of that mitigation. But if we don't, it's going to get the expenses increase hyperbolically. And I'm just talking about the cash expenses. I'm not
Right.
talking about the expense of like losing biodiversity and losing our coastlines and living in a hellish world. I'm just saying like we'll have less money, but like
Right.
the actual cost will be far far greater. So it's really just like everybody needs to do whatever they can in the moment to um, push faster, because there's still this sense it's like, okay, it's going to cost this much for the Green New Deal, and someone says seriously, they're like, well, that's going to cost like, you know, uh, that's going to cost. It's not cheaper to do that. Or they say, and this is the kind of like resilience in our own country. They're like, well, closing the coal mine is going to cost 200 jobs. Um, and the argument is always, oh, well, there's going to be more green jobs. Maybe there's not going to be more green jobs. Sometimes it's not always better to make the sustainable choice in every single level of analysis. Sometimes there are real costs and sometimes they're human. And the question is like, can we actually have a vocabulary for talking about the human cost of staying on the current path? Or is everybody so terrified of that we can't actually run a rational cost benefit analysis? Because I guarantee you, like those coal miners that want to keep their jobs do not want to be the reason that what could happen could happen. Like nobody alive is that self-involved. It's just that it hasn't been articulated. So I think just focusing on communication, pushing conversations, um, and just trying to do everything you can, and it's an exciting thing to work on because it's very consequential.
Yeah, no, I appreciate
Yeah.
you sharing that. I mean, I think like one of the things that I'm just curious about is like you it feels like we're having so many people are having the wrong conversations, right? We're looking up to the wrong ideals. Because if meat consumption is going to increase by 50% in the coming years, we are not having the right conversations. That is like such an obvious shift, but people look up to meat consumption as they look up to meat consumption, right? Instead of looking down upon meat consumption. And I think that so much of the opportunity we have when it comes to moving the needle forward can be like we can do a lot with food, right? And restaurants are an extraordinary communication tool to move human behavior. And I feel like that's what you're doing. I think that the question is like, how do we get more people on board, right? Like how do we get people to say, oh my God, like meat consumption needs to go down in the next 50 years versus, or, needs to go down 50% in the next year versus up.
I mean, for me, the answer comes back to building positive climate self-esteem, right? Like, yes, it's a terrible responsibility. This idea that your consumption in the present could, hurt people in the
Mm-hmm.
future, or the present. However, agency doesn't have to feel bad if you know what to do. Making choices that you can feel good about. Um, I mean, there's there's a responsibility, there's a terror, there's an anguish, but if you actually have a path, this idea that every single consumer decision you make in your life, you're actually voting on the most important issue that we're facing as its generations, that's awesome to be able to key directly into that and feel like you have a voice in this incredible shift toward sustainability. It's just like, how do you have a conversation with someone that gets detailed enough that they actually come away with it feeling good,
Right.
feeling good about climate change, feeling like, oh, I've been like ignorant of this whole thing and had like a low grade anxiety around it my entire life. And now I can hang in a conversation for a few minutes where I know what to do. And I think that's our role as, quote unquote, sustainable businesses that are trying to help people make this transition into, from an attitude of like feeling terrible I mean,
Mhm.
first it's denial, then you see what's going on and you feel terrible. And like,
Mhm.
uh, and then it's feeling like, oh, this is actually the only geopolitical issue in which I have a ton of agency. I have nothing to say about nuclear proliferation, nothing to say about human trafficking. Everything I do affects my carbon footprint.
Mhm.
And climate change is nothing other than the sum of everybody's individual decisions around their carbon footprint, and kind of just owning that responsibility. You can get to a point where it actually starts to be a source of self-esteem and pride, and not just negative reinforcement and confusion and shame. So
Yeah.
I think we decode that a little bit in the beginning, and then everybody will figure it out for themselves, but you just give them like one taste of like, and I think people had that with the straws, right? Like, why is
Right.
everybody talking so much about straws? Because it's something that's easy to give up, and that it makes you
Right.
feel good about doing it.
Totally. It's kind of like what you're saying almost feels like we need to build climate literacy, right? We need
Totally.
to
I think so.
learn how to read situations and read decisions and make the decisions that move the needle forward. Like I'm going to remember that little phrase because I think climate literacy is like what I'm kind of taking away from this. So if well, I'm taking away more than that, but you know what I mean. The so if
I,
go ahead.
I was going to say one other thing, like think about other issues where people get stuck, right?
Right.
Like financial literacy. It sucks to be intimidated and feel overwhelmed and like being terrified of your taxes. But over time, it's an area where people can build up, if they're given the right tools and the right language,
Right.
um, positive self-esteem there that like has a healthy effect on their life. Being able to control their health, being able to control their weight, right? It starts with understanding what a calorie is, right? What is the equivalent for carbon footprint? Well, it's a
Mhm.
metric ton per year, but like nobody really has any like way of relating to that, understanding how many cars that is per year taken off the road, how many trees that would be planted.
Right.
I think in the next few years, people are going to be able to, convert their carbon footprint into something that is a complete meaningless abstraction to something that they actually track as they would any other important thing that they want to measure and manage in their life. And that's kind of like the big picture of what we focus on at
Right.
Oberon, is like, how do you help people measure and manage their impact and therefore feel good about it, and then those good feelings translate into positive action.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. And I think that understanding like there's so much sort of jargon, right, around these things that just don't make what is a gigaton of carbon, right? What is a megaton? Like what do these things mean? And sure, we can plant trees, we can do this, we can do that, but what does it actually mean in relationship to the whole? Because I was reading, right, the straws, sure, gives you agency, makes you feel like you're in control. It's a what 0.0003% contribution to the plastics that are being made, which is like a subset. Anyways, we digress. But I think one of the things I wanted to ask of you is, okay, I am a newbie, a new person interested in this conversation. What are the 5 things that I can do on a daily basis? Or maybe I can ask you directly, what are the 5 things that you do on a daily basis where you find yourself making that decision, right? Like, oh, I go to the
Sure.
coffee shop and instead I always bring my own mug or like, you know,
Yeah, I think the things that in no particular order, what you eat, and understanding the different rough carbon footprint of a cow versus a chicken versus like kale or whatever.
mm-hmm.
uh Questions about transportation. Did you take a bike? Did you take a car? A question that New Yorkers ask themselves a lot. Am I going to take a taxi or a subway? That's a conversation that's about time and money. um 0 times in my life has anybody ever said, well, the carbon footprint of the Uber is this and the carbon footprint of the train is this. Nobody knows. Is it like 1,000 times as bad? Is it 10 times as bad? The train's running anyway, right? So consider taking the subway. Buying something in person as opposed to ordering something online. um And I would just say more than anything, just make an effort to try to understand what your carbon footprint is. Like there's a lot of great tools, and we happen to be working on one, but there's some amazing stuff online, where you can say, hey, like here's some facts about my life. Here's how big my apartment is. Here's how often I fly. Do I own a car? Do I have kids? And you can get a sense of what your carbon footprint is. Is it 25 uh, tons per year? Is it 55? And then you can set some goals like you would set goals in any other part of your life, like about how much money you want to make, or whatever it is that's important to you. And then once you're on that path where you understand where you are and you understand where you want to go, maybe you're at like 25 tons and you're like, I think that the United States should, I want to make sure that we comply with Paris. You comply with Paris. You lower your emissions like, 28%, right? It's totally doable. But it kind of sucks, like if you have to give up certain things that you care about. And then if you don't want to give up certain things that you care about, make sure that you at least invest in sequestration in the form of offsetting, so that you are not externalizing the costs of your consumption onto people you don't know. And that's also doable. Like you can invest in preserving acres of rainforest, or a million different things to try to bring your impact on the world down if you're struggling to figure out how to control your own consumption. Everybody finds their own path to taking responsibility. But the point is, it's not free, and it shouldn't be. Your costs shouldn't be passed on to somebody else just because we don't know how to measure them, and as a society we don't put a value on them. It doesn't make it right that we're kicking that can not that far down the road. It's definitely going to come up in our lifetimes, where the generation is going to be like, seriously, like the taxes that are going to be required to pay for that carbon cleanup are going to be high. So
Yeah.
you want to look back at this moment and be like, as of 2021, I was like neutral or something, like that you at least made an effort to look up what your individual contribution to the collective problem was. That I think is a first step, and I think that can be an incredibly empowering exercise for people, if a little bit painful at first.
Yeah.
It's like stepping on the scale.
Yeah.
Or like checking your bank account when you're overdrawn. It sucks.
Totally.
Like, it's the only way through.
Right. It's like looking in the mirror, really, right? It's like objectively looking at the situation and making a decision to change it. And I think once we begin changing it, it's an upward cycle of empowerment, right? We feel empowered, we feel excited, we feel energized, and we have the opportunity to share that. And the more people that we share it with, the more people that we educate, the more we educate ourselves, the more we can actually move the needle and hopefully kind of right the wrongs before it's absolutely too late. But I almost hate saying that because I feel like we're already into too late territory. So I think
we're into too late probabilities. There's already like a 20% probability that it's too late. Even if even if everybody tried to do everything that they could. But I don't think we're into too late certainty. And like, what the hell? As long as there's a chance to make it less bad, you have to do everything that you can do. We have to find like a meaning, being this generation that's going to be the cause and witness and hopefully stopping some of the worst effects. So I honestly think like there's no drama about whether or not climate change is going to become more of a thing that people are thinking about. It's certainly happening.
Yeah.
It's the least there's no that's 100%. So the sooner you kind of get with it and really understand it and get to know it, it'll be meaningful for you throughout your entire life that you kind of stood up and were doing more than everybody else was, at a moment where it's not anything, when it wasn't everything that people are talking about all the time, and that you're not just bullshitting about it. You're not greenwashing as an individual. You're not just signaling on social media, that you actually have some substance it'll feel good. It'll feel terrible to not do that. So I think more and more there's the rewards, there's personal rewards as well, aside from the fact it's just the right thing to do.
Henry, thank you so much for imparting so much wisdom.
I hope some of it's coherent.
I think it's all very coherent.
Big topic.
So yeah, it's a big topic. I feel like we could have, a few more follow-ups. But Henry, thank you so much. Is there a place that you'd like to direct people to find more about you and your work?
Yeah, sure. Our group website is the Oberon.co. That's THEOBERON. And yeah, it's if anybody, I don't know if anybody watching this has any questions about our work or things about they're interested in kind of getting involved in these different initiatives. We have a lot of different things we're trying to do in Brooklyn and in the Catskills and in the greater world of advocacy around individuals taking responsibility for their carbon footprints. So yeah, just feel free to contact me through the website. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. It's great that you're doing this, Gabe. So
thank you, Henry. I really appreciate it, and as always, value your time very much.
Cool. Talk soon.
Bye.